Number of years, I've done quite a number of optimization studies at pump and treat systems, dozens of them for multiple agencies. And, you know, it's an interesting experience to go visit these sites and see the various states that they're in. Certainly our focus when we do those studies is to identify opportunities to improve the performance and protectiveness and to reduce the cost. And in many cases, you know, we find that, you know, progress has been made, but the progress hasn't been what's been expected. I mean, every once in a while we do come across sites where the pump and treat systems have been pretty successful at meeting their goals, that there's been substantial, you know, in some cases even 2 orders of magnitude declines in concentrations. But more often than not, we find that the pump and treat systems have been disappointing, to say the least. In some cases, it's a matter of that pump and treat really wasn't maybe a good remedy to implement. It may date back to times when we really didn't have the understanding of other technology options. In other cases, it's been a matter of the pump and treat hasn't necessarily been implemented in the most efficient way. And so we try to offer ways to improve what's there, and, you know, and to offer a sense of strategy going forward. And I think this document really helps identify the kinds of thought process you have to go through to identify those long-term strategies. And in many cases, particularly where the results have been disappointing, we offer suggestions as to what can be done to supplement the pump and treat with additional source treatment. That's a big one. You know, or other technologies, you know, to work in concert with the pump and treat, or in some cases just to obviate the need for the pump and treat and go with something else, some kind of more in situ remedy or whatever. The case studies that the document has tries to illustrate, you know, a lot of the situations that Mike talked about that the document, you know, logic lays out. Certainly reflect a lot of the experiences I've seen. You know, a number of the sites that I've looked at have been able to at least temporarily, you know, to evaluate the efficacy of M&A at the site. As I say, we've had other sites where they've done more supplemental, particularly source treatment, to see if reducing the cumulative mass discharge allows, you know, better performance for the pump and treat and declines throughout the dissolved phase plume. In a lot of cases, we've offered optimization ideas that have not only improved the performance at the site, but have also significantly lowered costs. A lot of times the pumping wells aren't in the right places, they aren't at the right depths, and of course there's optimization aspects to the related treatment options too. And a lot of times the big dollar savings comes from looking at the above ground treatment for the extracted water. But I think if you look at the case studies in the document, you're going to get a good flavor for how the logic, you know, really applies to real sites. Within the case studies, there's a nice table just summarizing the decision elements and sort of identifies the site-specific information that kind of checks off each one of those decision elements. You know, what was it about the site that matches up with these? And I do want to emphasize that a lot of times it's looking at what information we can get from the data collected, looking at the extraction rates, looking at the contaminant trends within different wells, different parts of the plume. That's really critical. But in a lot of cases, there's data gaps that we should probably fill as part of this process. And I mentioned before that source treatment is very important, while understanding the residual source is very important. I have a project I'm consulting on now in EPA Region 2 where they had essentially very low levels in the monitoring wells and very high levels in the extraction wells, which is something you don't normally see. Went out and did some direct push sampling, and lo and behold, they found a very discrete residual NAPL source zone within just 2 or 3 feet, actually well below the water table, even though it was an LNAPL type site. And that site characterization totally changed the conceptual site model. So really looking at what you know and then some of the things you don't know, very important. I think the case studies kind of highlight those kind of things. And The key calculations, though, particularly for the transition M&A, is understanding your source strength, what you can do to manage that source strength or reduce it, versus what your attenuation capacity is. So anyway, those are sort of kind of big picture overview of the case studies. Let's talk very specifically now about a large groundwater problem at Tooele Army Depot in Utah. Tooele Army Depot has had a long industrial history, starting back in World War II. They did a lot of equipment maintenance, heavy maintenance, engine rebuilding, that kind of stuff. Generated a lot of solvents that were disposed of to various unlined ditches, went to an unlined lagoon, a lot of places for the contaminants to leach into the groundwater. The exceptional characteristic of the site, we were talking before about deep vadose zones. This is one where the groundwater is at about 100 meters below the surface, very thick vadose zone, highly permeable, sand and gravel aquifers, and so you have a fairly large plume shown there on the right that's resulted. Actually, it's what you see there is actually two separate commingled plumes, in part coming from multiple sources, including some of the ditches and lagoons, also a sanitary landfill. And they actually did do pump and treat starting in the early 1990s, 7,500 gallons a minute type capacity, so a big system with air stripping. Based on the poor performance of that extraction system, and that was only for the portion of the plume that is what's called the main plume over here. The other plume over here was not being addressed by the pump and treat system. They call that northeast plume. And based on what they were seeing, they said, let's go ahead and turn the pump and treat system off. They did what was called, I love this term, this is real government speak, the non-operational test, the NOT test. And so they turned the pump and treat system off, and they were going to monitor the plume and see what the changes were. That actually was accepted by the regulatory agencies, and it continues to this day. There's no active treatment there. But they are monitoring the plume as time goes on. They focus their efforts now on source treatment. So they're doing soil vapor extraction within the vadose zone to remove contaminant mass there. They're doing air sparging near the source areas to treat the higher concentrations in the groundwater. And then monitoring the down gradient portions of the plume, carefully looking at the contaminant trends. What they've sort of set up as a strategy for monitoring the site is they've created a management zone, which is about 1 mile outside the current plume boundaries. And the regulatory agencies have said that you can manage the plume within that buffer zone, essentially. And so they're looking at that carefully. They do a very good job of keeping a groundwater model up to date. Basically, every 2 years they update a sophisticated groundwater flow and transport model. And they use that to evaluate what kind of future condition the plume would have. So this gets at some of the things that Mike was saying, trying to predict what the future plume behavior is going to be. The model, though, because of the very aerobic nature of the plume, and this is largely a TC plume, there are some other chlorinated compounds in there, but natural attenuation by reductive dechlorination is not a particularly active process. They are looking at other degradation type processes, but right now that model, the flow and transport model, does not account for any degradation at all. And so according to the model, there is some growth to the plume that would be expected over time. And we are seeing some changes in the plume boundary, some growth in that, but not as much as we would have thought a few years ago based on the model output. What's kind of interesting is that the flow and transport model has been run using a number of stochastic type approaches to look at the probability of exceeding that 1 mile buffer zone at points into the future. They've used ensemble Kalman filtering most recently to evaluate those kind of things. Otherwise, Monte Carlo kind of techniques, drawing different parameters within from within the parameters for the model to see what the likely time frame would be. But anyway, right now it does look like the plume is eventually going to grow beyond that zone, but because the plume isn't expanding as quickly as you would think, there's got to be some other kind of assimilative capacity out there. So they're looking at other natural degradation processes, looking at potential co-metabolism with other organics within the subsurface, even though it's aerobic co-metabolism can occur. We're also looking at reactive minerals as another control mechanism. So here's a nice table. This is representative of what's in the case studies within the document. Shows the decision element and the site-specific assessment where we are with each of those. And then, again, just to kind of summarize some of the challenges that we have, the aerobic aquifer, again, means no reductive dechlorination, but looking at these other degradation processes. The challenge is really now trying to take what we're seeing out there and some work that's being done in the lab and trying to come up with some degradation rates that could be put into the model so that we can better account for what the future conditions are going to be within that plume. One real positive thing about the site is that the regulatory agencies are very supportive of what's being done at the site. We have a wonderful state regulator who is very knowledgeable, very interested in some of these advanced modeling techniques, advanced theoretical degradation processes, and trying to see if they apply at the site. So it's been a wonderful collaborative kind of situation. Both of those plumes extend off the installation boundary, so it does go off-site. There are very few off-site receptors until you get quite a ways down gradient where there are irrigation and some domestic wells. So we have that as kind of, that gives us that buffer zone that I mentioned before. Otherwise, it would be an entirely different situation, and containment for at least some limited pump and treat would probably be in place. But there is a contingent action if the plume reaches that management boundary. We would actually implement some type of air sparging for containment. In the source area, air sparging seems to have had a very positive impact. Concentrations have declined substantially. Because of the highly permeable sand and gravel aquifer that's there with only limited low permeability zones, we get fairly good air distribution and treatment by the air sparging.